you very much. That was a lovely introduction. I really appreciate that. This is joint work with my colleague and also my husband, Larry Kahn. And just briefly, what this paper is about is that we use a data set that I don't think Doug has heard of. It's something called the New Immigrant Survey.
Or anybody here.
Collected and right here to investigate the separate effects of immigrant women's own labor supply prior to migrating and the female labor supply in their source countries on the behavior and wages of immigrant women here. So let me spend a few minutes explaining to you why I think this is interesting and important. First of all, there has been an increase in immigration, and I think this is a place where I don't have to say very much about that. I'm sure you're all aware of that. But the foreign-born share in the U.S. has risen considerably. There's also, and this has gotten a lot of attention as well, a shift in the source countries, where, say, in 1970, the vast majority of immigrants came from Europe or North America. Today, the majority come from Latin America and Asia. But one aspect of this shift, which has gotten less attention, is that immigrants now, on average, come from countries with a more traditional division of labor than they did before in comparison to the U.S. And I'm using that term, traditional division of labor, denoting lower female participation rates and higher birth rates. Mirroring this, Larry and I, working with Carrie Papps, have found there's a growing gap between the labor supply of Native and immigrant women since 1980 as source countries have shifted. So let me illustrate this for you. And this is annual work hours on the y-axis, and for 2 years, 1980 and 2000, immigrants in blue, natives in red. And you'll see that in 1980, this is, by the way, annual work hours including the zero, so it takes in labor force participation and how much people work when they're in the labor force. And you'll see in 1980 there really actually wasn't such a big difference between immigrants and natives, but by 2000 there was a large difference for women, but when you look at men, when you look at men, the situation had not changed very much. So this suggests that this is a gender-specific pattern, and it is mirroring what's going on in the source countries. So this raises some questions. Are immigrant-native differences that we see in this country related to source country characteristics? There's been some previous work on that by myself and others that I'll be pointing to. But we're going to look at an additional layer of this, and that is, are the observed effects of source country characteristics due to a community-wide type of factor, like culture or social capital, or could it just represent individual experience? So women from high participation source countries are more likely to have themselves worked prior to migrating. And with that additional labor force experience, they're much more likely to work here. That could be the whole story, or it could be a significant part of this story. So that's one of the things we'll be exploring here. Now, in terms of community level characteristics, what we're thinking about, and much similar types of research, is this idea of culture. And I'm sure it's not a new idea to you, but let me just explain how we're using it here, following on some work by Fernandez and Foley. The idea of systematic differences in preferences and beliefs across either socially or geographically differentiated groups that affect their behavior when they move, let's say in this case they change countries. Now, this is a growing area of research in economics. Traditionally, it was confined to other social sciences. But I think one reason that economists have gotten interested in it is actually preferences and tastes are a big part of economic models, but we hardly ever get into how those preferences and tastes are formed. And this gets us inside, or helps to get us inside that black box. But the observed correlations between source country characteristics and immigrant women's behavior here, to the extent they're not due to the experience that in the labor market they had before they migrate, they could be due to social capital, which is a different concept from culture. And in particular, social capital refers to social interactions or community level characteristics that enhance skills and wages. And those may take the form of role models, expectations, behavioral norms, or interpersonal networks. But what I've highlighted in red is the distinction between these two concepts is that culture refers to, oh, sorry, I keep thinking the pointer is the thing that's actually, sorry, I back, okay. Culture refers to preferences and beliefs, whereas social capital refers to enhancement of skills and wages. So what we're going to try to do in this work is to break down any effect of source country characteristics on labor supply here as to whether they are due to wages, an impact on wages. It could be that the source country characteristic increases your wages that you could earn in the labor market, those higher wages draw you in, or the extent to which they are due to preferences and beliefs not responding to wages. Become more clear as I go along. Okay, another issue that has not been explored before that we're going to look up here is whether whether source country environment and the individual's own experience are substitutes or complements. And we think it's plausible they could be either. And the effect, it's basically an empirical question. So on the one hand, growing up in a country where women expect to work outside the home may itself impart skills and influence preferences. Market work before migration could also impart skills and influence preferences. It could be that there's substitution between the two. In high female participation source countries, even women who don't themselves work before migrating might acquire job-related skills or work orientation, but it's plausible they could be complements. In high female participation countries, the quality of your labor market experience may also be higher. You may get access to better jobs and where you can accumulate more skills. So we're going to look at whether these two concepts are complements or substitutes. So earlier work definitely suggests a role of source country characteristics a role of source country characteristics relating to gender roles, that is source country labor supply and fertility, on immigrant behavior here in the U.S., and I've cited a number of studies, and the behavior of second-generation individuals in the U.S. So source country characteristics have been found to be correlated with the behavior of the second generation. And let me just illustrate our contribution to this in terms of immigrants. And what we found in previous work is that this is annual work hours of married immigrant women relative to natives. So that across here we have annual work hours, and 0 means there's no difference to natives. And these are the years since migration, 0 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15. And this is based on following particular cohorts over time, so it separates out the cohort effects. This is following people with their years in the U.S.
Is that census data?
Yes, census data. And it controls for all measured characteristics of the women and their spouses. And we've divided, we've simulated from our regressions what we call low activity rate source countries. Activity rate is really the term that international agency used for participation rate. That basically means participation rate. At the 25th percentile in our samples, and high activity rate countries at the 75th percentile. And we find that people who come from countries with high participation, well, first of all, let me say both groups start below natives, and this could reflect disruption, it could reflect visa problems, whatever. Both do assimilate towards natives, especially in the first 6 to 10 years, but there's a gap between them, and that gap is persistent. It stays at about the same level, about a 10% gap, throughout their time in the U.S. So the women from high activity source countries catch up to natives, and the women from lower activity rate source countries lag behind a little. And so this does suggest possibly a role of culture, especially in its persistence, the fact that it's not eroded with exposure to the U.S. labor market, U.S. norms. So again, our contribution is that earlier work does suggest that source country female participation rates influence immigrant women's labor supply behavior in the U.S., but we're going to separate out the extent to which, using the new immigrant survey, this is due to exposure in the source country, so the women have worked before they migrated, versus the impact of aggregate source country female labor supply. We're going to try to shed light on the mechanisms through which the source country environment affects immigrant women's labor market outcomes and labor supply in the U.S., focusing on trying to distinguish between culture and social capital. And we're going to study whether immigrant women's own behavior and the source country environment act as substitutes or complements in the U.S. Labor market. Jumping ahead, we find that pre-migration labor supply strongly affects labor supply in the U.S. So that's an interesting variable to look at. It does have a strong effect. Source country, in this data set as another, source country female labor supply strongly affects U.S. labor supply. But the key thing here is that 90% of the effect of source country labor supply remains even after we control for the individual's own pre-migration labor supply. So this is very suggestive of and provides further evidence of the impact of culture. We find the two concepts are substitutes rather than complements. So we find a negative interaction effect between whether or not you worked in the source country or how much you worked and source country labor supply. And so as an example, evaluating the interaction, the effect of source country female labor supply on U.S. labor supply and wages is larger for women who did not work before they migrated rather than for women who did work before they migrated. So putting this a little differently, coming from a high activity rate source country can compensate for a lack of your own personal experience. Further, we find that most of the effect of source country female labor supply operates through, or does not, very little of it operates through wages, which would be what we economists would call a movement along the supply curve. Most of it seems to be due to an outward shift in the supply curve, and that implies that culture is more important than social capital for this phenomenon. The data, again, is a new immigrant survey. It's a survey, a random sample of newly legalized immigrants in 2003 primarily. Not a sample of, it's not a sample of all immigrants, since about 40% of U.S. immigrants are undocumented, and some of the NIS respondents were previously undocumented. So it's not all immigrants, but it is all newly legalized immigrants. We focus on adult immigrants in order to give individuals a chance to have worked prior to migrating. We compared in the paper, we did compare the NIS respondents to respondents from the 2000 U.S. Census and the 2005 American Community Survey. And we did find some differences. And we found the NIS respondents, as you would expect, since they are a legalized group, are better educated and older than recent immigrants in the census and ACS. But importantly for our study, we found very similar gender differences in labor supply in both data sets, and a very similar gender wage gap in both data sets. Okay, we have two dependent variables, annual work hours, as I said again, including the zeros. We analyzed those with both OLS and TOBIT. It didn't make any difference. I'm going to focus on the OLS results here. And the log of hourly earnings for wage and salary workers who were not enrolled in school. The explanatory variables for labor supply first include both individual characteristics and source country characteristics. In terms of individual characteristics, the one we're primarily interested in is their pre-migration labor supply. But we want to control for other factors that might be important, including age, pre-migration schooling, which is another a desirable variable that's available in the NIS, whether or not they're married, their race and ethnicity, and their years since migration. In terms of source country characteristics, we're most interested in this key variable is female divided by male activity rate ratio. The reason we look at this as a ratio is twofold. First of all, it's conceptually what we want. We are interested in the gender division of labor. But secondly, there can be problems with international data on labor force participation to the extent that these problems affect measures of male and female labor supply in the source country. By doing it as a ratio, we net out this problem. But we also, and unlike some of the other work in this area, we also control for a lot of other source country characteristics, so we can really pinpoint the role of source country female labor supply. So we control for GDP per capita, primary and secondary enrollment rates, distance to the U.S., English-speaking, whether it's an English-speaking country or an English official country, and completed fertility. And so we do want to control for a variety of factors that would influence how employable the immigrants would be, and some may relate to selection as well. There's an argument that when you come from a longer distance, the investment is more costly, and so you want to be more certain that it has a higher return. And then we also interact pre-migration labor supply and the female / male activity rate ratio. Our standard errors are clustered at the source country level. Now, this is a huge list of additional specifications this paper has been through. First of all, we're very thorough and complete researchers, but this paper's been through an extensive review process as well. And I'm not going to have a chance to go through all of them. Some I will relate to. show you results on some, you'll have to kind of take my word. None of this affected negatively. Our results held up to all this. But let me mention, first of all, that in this paper, as in previous work, we analyzed male labor supply, and I'm going to show this to you. And this is basically a falsification test. We want to show that there is something gender specific going on, and it's not just a general difference in terms of source countries, in terms of labor market readiness or orientation. We do control for source country specific immigration rates to help to control for average selection of outmigration. We don't include that in all our specifications because we feel that it is partly endogenous as to how well the immigrants are doing in the United States. Our variable, again, sorry, I don't know, I think it's my clicker has this pointer on the top. But anyway, we do, as I said, our dependent variable is annual work hours, but we also look at current labor force participation and employment as the dependent variables with the same results. We both exclude and include visa type. Visa type is another nice variable that's available in this data set, but we believe it is partly endogenous. So we don't include it in all the specifications, but verify our results with it included. We also look at what happens when we have regional dummies or dummies for the largest source countries, and continue to find support for our results. We control for, in some specifications, not our main ones, religious tradition and frequency of religious observance, and our results are robust to that. Interestingly, we thought there's a lot of religions specified. We thought we'd see a lot of differences among the religions, but the main difference we found is having any religion relative to not being religious. And so being religious seems to lower labor supply. We include education in the U.S. and fertility in some models with similar results. These are excluded from the basic model due to their endogeneity. We analyze married women separately for two reasons. They may have be more impacted by gender roles, but also married women, in the vast majority of them, we're able to identify which ones come at the same time as their spouses. So they might be what economists call tide movers. So if the migration decision was primarily a job-related decision for their husbands and the women are also coming along, they may be a less selected group. So there's less of a problem with selection being the reason for our findings for them. When we analyze married women, we include their husband's characteristics, and we look at highly educated and less educated women separately and find similar results. So for wages, we have basically the same setup, but we additionally include years of schooling in the U.S. because we thought it's very interesting to compare returns to foreign and U.S. schooling, and those do break out as we would have expected, as you'll see, with higher returns to schooling in the U.S. We account for selection into employment by performing a Heckman two-step selectivity bias correction that's identified by including a number of own children in the first stage. So to the results. So this is our analysis of annual work hours for women, and we let me say all of these regressions include some basic variables that I haven't broken out here, but age and race primarily. So in the first column, we have no other source country characteristics. We don't control for visa type, but we look at, oops, sorry. I'm going, oh, sorry. I think I may have to stop pointing, but I'll keep trying. We look at annual work hours before migrating and find strong, significant positive effect, as we would expect. Also of interest is years of school before migrating through all specification is positive and significant. Then we add all other source country characteristics except source country female participation rates. It doesn't really affect the effect of working before you came. Then we exclude that variable and just look at source country female labor supply, and that has a strong positive effect. The key thing is, and that, by the way, includes other source country variables. The key thing is when we put them both together, and we find actually that whether or not you worked before you came, annual hours of it doesn't change very much. There is a reduction in this coefficient, but again, about 90% of its effect remains. So the finding that source country female labor supply influences the behavior of immigrant women in the U.S. today, controlling for their personal characteristics and other source country characteristics remains even when you, most of it remains even when you control for whether or not they work before migrating. Then in the final two columns, we first look at the interaction between these two variables, and we do find it's negative and significant. And then in the final column, we control as well for visa, and that does not, visa type, that does not greatly affect our results. So those are kind of the central results for labor supply. Here we evaluate the interaction effects. So we look at, we look at the effect, the hours effect of pre-migration employment versus not being employed at all before coming to the U.S. We look at it for low female activity rate countries and high female activity rate countries, and we see here, as I had mentioned, that the effect is larger. It's significant in both cases, but the effect is larger if you come from a low female activity rate country. We look at the hours effect of high versus low female activity rate countries, and we find for those who did not work before coming, a larger effect than those who worked before coming to the U.S. But significant in all cases. Okay, then we take a quick look at at the results for men, and we do find a strong effect in most specifications for having worked before you came to the U.S. We find years of schooling before migrating have a positive effect, but there's no indication of these more gender-specific variables, namely the female activity rate ratio in the source country having any effect on males. So it does seem to be a gender-specific factor. All right, now I'm just going to look at hourly earnings for women with, again, a similar setup. The results are broadly similar, but they are not as significant. So working before migrating is positive, about the same size as its standard error. Coming from a high a high female activity rate country is positive, about the same as its standard error. Actually, the results are improved when we include the interaction, where working before migrating does get significantly positive. And in one of the specifications, coming from a high female labor supply source country is also positive, again significant in one case and considerably larger than its standard error in the other, and the interaction is negative. So the results are broadly similar. They're not as significant. These are just results for the Heckman selectivity correction. It doesn't make much difference, so I will skip over those. Evaluating the interaction term, we again see this pattern with some evidence of statistical significance that if you come from a low female activity rate country, there's some evidence of a statistically significant effect of pre-migration work experience, and there's actually no evidence of this if you come from a high female activity rate country. If you, the effect of coming from a high or versus a low female activity rate country, if you have no pre-migration experience, again, there is some evidence of a statistically significant effect. There's little evidence of effect if you worked before migrating. So we find some evidence of an impact of source country characteristics and actually whether you worked before coming to the U.S. on women's labor supply here. Is that due to a movement along a given supply curve? So is it due to the fact that women from high activity rate countries have higher wages and that draw wage offers and that draws them into the labor market? Or is it a shift in the labor supply curve, which would indicate preferences? To do this, to examine this question, we evaluate our coefficients that I've reviewed here on source country female labor supply from the hours and wage regressions using estimates of recent estimates of female labor supply elasticities in the U.S. that we developed in other work. And we find that movements along the labor supply curve, that is, responses to being able to get a higher wage, explain just a very, very small part of the observed relationship between the source country characteristic and women's labor supply in the U.S. So most of our hours results are due to shifts in the whole labor supply function that is consistent with impacts on tastes and preferences rather than effects on wages, which would be the route that we'd expect social capital to take. Now let me also consider the possibility that I touched on earlier, that our results could be due to immigrant selectivity. So we have found, for example, selectivity meaning the type of women who come from various countries with various female participation rates. So we have found, for example, that source country female activity rate has a smaller effect for women who who worked prior to migration. Now there's some evidence that female labor supply is positive, or that women's participation in the labor force is positively selective, meaning that those who have higher wage offers are the ones who are most likely to enter. Now, one particular piece of research did find that especially in countries with very low female participation rates, that the women who were actually in the labor force were a very positively selected group. So if that's true, it actually could help explain our finding of the fact that the female activity rate has a smaller effect for women who work prior to migration. And that is that the women in the low female participation rate countries may be especially positively selected relative to the women from the high female participation rate countries. So it could explain one component of the interaction effect, but it actually cannot explain the other component of it, because what the interaction effect is also saying is that there's a especially strong effect of source country activity rate on women who do not work at all. Now, the same reasoning we applied before suggests that women who come from a high participation rate source country who don't work in the labor market are a particularly negatively selected group. They're the small numbers who have not been drawn in by the labor force opportunities. And yet, this is the group that we're finding has an especially large effect of source country female labor supply. So, just on grounds of logic, we feel that immigrant selectivity cannot provide a reasonable alternative for our findings. In addition, when we restrict the sample to married women, and even in some runs we restrict the sample to married women who came to the United States at the same time as their husbands, we get very similar results. And as I mentioned before, they may be more likely to be called what we call high movers, where the husband may make the decision to move, and they have come along, so they're not coming based on their own self-selection, and yet our results are similar. And then we also do make an effort to control for other factors that could be related to selection, like distance to the U.S., I mentioned before, could be associated with how positively selected the group is. People coming from a long distance may be particularly positively selected because they want to compensate for the higher costs of immigration and the average immigration rate. When we control for that, it doesn't influence our results. So, conclusions. I think it's one of the first times I'm going quicker than I expected. I'm usually slower, but anyway. Most of the source country effect on U.S. labor supply remains even after we control for own pre-migration labor supply, which itself strongly influences U.S. labor supply. Some evidence suggests that most of the source country effect is due to the impact of culture rather than social capital. Let me say that I don't personally believe that these are watertight distinctions. I mean, for example, let's say due to your beliefs and preferences, you are drawn into the labor market. Well, just participating in the labor market is going to enhance your skills. Or let's say just due to your higher skills, you're drawn into the labor market. Well, that's going to influence your beliefs and preferences. But using a relatively simple approach, we attempted to delineate how much of the effect of source country female participation on work hours of women here in the U.S. was due to the wage component. We found that only very little of it could be explained by that. We also found that own work experience and source country environment are substitutes in affecting labor supply in the U.S. And I find this potentially, quite interesting, that a global aggregate environmental variable like the culture and norms and work behavior of women in your source country could substitute for an individual level variable like whether or not you personally work. And there's some evidence of this both in the female labor supply regressions, but also in the wage regressions. Now, looking towards the future, and what I've emphasized here is really differences among immigrants depending on their source countries. Let me back up to say that our work has generally found a considerable amount of assimilation, but also looking towards the future, it seems like source country gender roles may be less important. For one thing, U.S. women's labor supply has plateaued. It's actually very little increase in female labor supply since the mid-1990s. But other countries' labor supply has continued to rise. And just as an example here, between 1991 and 2010, female labor force participation in Mexico rose from 38% to 54%, while it increased from 74% to 75% in the U.S. It basically didn't change in the U.S. So the rest of the world is likely catching up to us in terms of female participation. So immigrants coming in are going to have, in the future, less of a distinctive experience. That would lead us to expect some further convergence of immigrant women's and native women's labor supply in the U.S. The other thing that's very striking is the dramatic decrease in fertility rates that have occurred around the world. So women coming in are less likely to be traditional in this regard as well, looking towards the future. Oops. No, sorry. Okay, we're all done, actually.